Imagine for a moment that the greatest spiritual secret of your life has been hiding in front of you the entire time. Imagine discovering that many of the teachings attributed to Jesus, teachings capable of awakening the deepest layers of human consciousness, were never truly lost, only forgotten, overshadowed, or left in the margins of history. Think about how differently humanity might understand purpose, destiny, and the nature of the soul if these messages had been fully embraced. And now imagine that you are about to rediscover them. Pence in the possibility that Jesus was not only a moral guide, but a master of profound spiritual knowledge, aligned with ancient esoteric traditions that existed long before his birth. Throughout centuries, scholars, researchers, and mystics have pointed to this deeper dimension. Elaine Pagels, a respected expert on early Christian writings, emphasizes that hidden beneath the familiar narratives is a mystical core that speaks directly to the transformation of consciousness. Bart Ehrman, another leading academic, shows how early manuscripts reveal that the spiritual landscape around Jesus was far richer than what most people ever learned. Marvin Meyer and Jean-Yves Leloup devoted their lives to bringing forward the forgotten sayings of Jesus, found in ancient texts that challenge conventional interpretations and reveal a teacher who spoke in symbols, paradoxes, and metaphors to awaken the inner world of his listeners. This video will take you into that realm, the realm where the forgotten teachings of Jesus emerge not as secrets meant for the few, but as a path for every seeker willing to look beyond the surface. And let me tell you this now, the final revelation in this journey is the most powerful of all. It is designed to touch the very core of your being and shift the way you understand your own spiritual potential. Stay with me until the end, because each moment builds toward a truth capable of transforming your life. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, comment your thoughts, and share this video with others who seek wisdom beyond the ordinary. The insights we are about to uncover may change the way many people interpret spirituality, history, and the nature of the divine. Your engagement helps this message reach more seekers across the world. Now, imagine the world in which Jesus lived. Far from a simple or isolated culture, his surroundings were filled with mysticism, symbolism, and ancient knowledge. The Essenes, a group known for their deep spiritual practices, lived near where Jesus spent much of his life. Scholars like Edmund Wilson and Geza Vermes argue that their teachings on purity, meditation, symbolism, and inner transformation directly influenced the spiritual environment of the region. At the same time, the echoes of Hermetic philosophy, which explored the connection between the divine and the human, were circulating among scholars of the ancient Near Eastern world. These ideas taught that the universe is a reflection of spiritual laws and that the human being contains a spark of the divine within, a concept astonishingly similar to many of Jesus' sayings. Why then do these deeper elements feel absent from mainstream teachings? Why do so many of the most transformative messages attributed to Jesus appear only in manuscripts discovered long after his time, such as those found in Nag Hammadi in the 20th century? Why do these texts emphasize inner awakening, self-knowledge, and spiritual transformation rather than external ritual or obedience? Ask yourself something deeply personal. What changes in your life if you accept the idea that Jesus' message was not merely about following commandments, but about discovering the kingdom of heaven within your own consciousness? What if his words were not merely moral instructions, but keys to unlock your spiritual potential? Throughout the Gospels, Jesus speaks in parables, a language filled with symbols that resonate with ancient mystical traditions. The seed, the light, the vine, the door, the path, the inner room, the lost treasure. Each image hides layers of meaning that go beyond literal interpretation. According to scholars like Rudolf Bultmann, these metaphors were intentionally crafted to awaken the listener, to provoke insight, to draw the seeker inward. Jesus often spoke of mysteries meant for those with ears to hear, a phrase that scholars interpret as an invitation to look deeper, beyond the surface of his words. But here is the most intriguing question. If these teachings were so powerful, why were they forgotten? Why did some interpretations flourish while others were silenced, marginalized, or even declared heretical? Many historians argue that as Christianity institutionalized, certain mystical teachings were considered too empowering, too challenging to hierarchical structures. Teachings about inner divinity, direct connection with the divine or the necessity of personal spiritual awakening were dangerous ideas in a world where power was often maintained through religious authority. Imagine what it means if Jesus truly intended every person to realize their own divine nature. Imagine if his purpose was not only to offer salvation, but to reveal the spiritual science of inner transformation, a science that mirrors the principles of Hermetic teachings, where the microcosm reflects the macrocosm and where the human soul mirrors the divine. As we move deeper into this journey, keep one thought alive within you. What if the forgotten teachings of Jesus are not about discovering something external, but about awakening something internal? Before we continue deeper, take a breath and imagine that the teachings we are exploring were never meant for passive listening. They were meant to ignite something within you, a shift of perception, a widening of awareness, an awakening of the inner self. The forgotten teachings of Jesus speak directly to the seeker who desires more than surface-level answers. They speak to those who sense that reality holds layers beyond the material world and that the divine is far closer than they were ever told. Now pense in this. Throughout ancient writings, Jesus repeatedly emphasizes the inner world as the true sanctuary. He speaks of the secret place, the inner chamber, the hidden treasure buried within the field of the soul. These ideas are not isolated. The Gospel of Thomas, studied extensively by researchers like Marvin Meyer and April D. Connick, presents Jesus as a master of self-knowledge. In these texts, he teaches that when a person comes to truly know themselves, they simultaneously discover their connection to the divine. This echoes the timeless wisdom found in Hermetic philosophy, where the journey inward is the path to ultimate truth. Imagine how revolutionary this message would have been in the ancient world. At a time when religious authority was centralized and tightly controlled, Jesus pointed people toward a direct experience of the divine, one that did not require temples, rituals, or intermediaries. His message empowered the individual. It awakened personal responsibility for spiritual growth. It taught that the spark of the divine was already within, waiting to be awakened through awareness, compassion, and inner alignment. This is one of the reasons many scholars argue that some teachings attributed to Jesus may have been suppressed or overshadowed. Elaine Pagels highlights that early Christian communities were diverse, holding a variety of interpretations about Jesus' message. Some emphasized mystical knowledge, others focused on institutional structure. As time passed, certain interpretations gained dominance while others faded into obscurity. But fading is not the same as disappearing. These teachings remained preserved in hidden manuscripts, carried by spiritual communities and echoed in the works of mystics across centuries. Think about the teachings that survived in the writings of early Christian mystics like Evagrius Ponticus, Origen, and the Desert Fathers. Their works speak of inner transformation, contemplation, and the direct experience of divine light. They describe the human being as a vessel of divine presence, a being capable of profound spiritual awakening. These ideas reflect what many historians believe Jesus actually taught, not merely obedience but transformation, not merely belief but awakening. Now ask yourself, why would Jesus insist that the kingdom of heaven is within you? Why would he emphasize the power of forgiveness, compassion, and deep inner stillness? Why would he use stories that point to spiritual rebirth, inner illumination, and the unveiling of hidden truth? When he spoke of the light that shines in the darkness, scholars like Dale Allison suggest he was not speaking only of moral righteousness, but of the spiritual illumination that arises when a person discovers their true nature. The light in this sense is awareness, a spark of divine consciousness capable of dissolving ignorance and fear. This interpretation aligns with mystical traditions across the world, from the Upanishads to the teachings of the ancient Essenes, all of which speak of inner light as the essence of spiritual awakening. Consider the possibility that Jesus understood universal spiritual laws. Many researchers argue that his teachings mirror principles found in ancient wisdom traditions: the law of correspondence, the power of intention, the creative potential of thought and word, and the interconnectedness of all beings. When he said that faith, as small as a mustard seed, could move mountains, he may have been referring to the immense creative power of consciousness, a principle recognized by Hermetic and esoteric philosophies long before and long after his time. Imagine the implications of this. If Jesus taught that each person carries within them a divine spark, and if this spark has the potential to shape reality, then the forgotten teachings are not only spiritually profound, they are personally transformative. They invite you to see yourself not as a passive observer in the universe, but as a co-creator in alignment with divine wisdom. But here is where the journey becomes even more intriguing. Many of the forgotten teachings emphasize self-knowledge as the key to spiritual awakening. In the ancient manuscripts, Jesus says that when you know yourself, you will be known, and you will realize that you are a child of the living Father. This message is not about arrogance or separation, but about recognizing the sacredness of your own existence. Ask yourself, what happens when you stop searching outside and begin exploring within? What truths emerge when you dare to look into the depths of your own consciousness? What fears, illusions, or limitations might dissolve when you understand that the divine has placed its spark inside you? These are the questions that define the forgotten teachings. They are not merely historical curiosities. They are living principles meant to be experienced, lived, and embodied. And the deeper we go, the more these teachings reveal their power. Think for a moment about how transformative it is to realize that the forgotten teachings of Jesus were never meant to create followers, but to awaken creators. Throughout ancient sources, he does not describe a distant divinity separated from humanity by hierarchy or ritual. Instead, he speaks of unity, of oneness, of a connection so intimate that he uses metaphors of light, breath, and inner life to describe it. Scholars such as Karen King and Harold Bloom argue that Jesus' deepest teachings belong to the lineage of spiritual knowledge that empowers the seeker to awaken, to transform, and to see reality with new eyes. Imagine Jesus speaking to a crowd, knowing that only a few would truly understand the layers hidden in each parable. Imagine him seeing beyond appearances, recognizing the divine spark within each person, even those who doubted him. Imagine how radical it must have sounded when he said that the kingdom of heaven was not in the sky, not in a temple, and not in any external structure, but within. This was not poetry. This was a direct statement about the true nature of consciousness. It challenged the spiritual, political, and cultural status quo. Now pence in how often he used symbols of transformation: water becoming wine, blindness turning into sight, death giving way to rebirth. These were not merely miracles, according to many historians. They were spiritual metaphors. John Dominic Crossan suggests that Jesus frequently encoded profound insights in symbolic acts to reveal deeper truths about the human condition. Through symbolism, he taught that inner transformation is possible, that old identities can dissolve, and that a more awakened self can emerge. Ask yourself, what if the real miracle Jesus pointed to was not the alteration of the external world, but the awakening of the inner world? What if the greatest healing he offered was the healing of perception, the healing of the soul's relationship with its own divine origin? Throughout ancient texts such as the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Thomas, there is a consistent theme. The journey inward is the path to divine understanding. These writings, studied by Elaine Pagels, Marvin Meyer, and François Bovon, reveal a Jesus who teaches the importance of inner stillness, introspection, and spiritual insight. He speaks to the one who dares to look beyond external authority and enter the sanctuary of their own consciousness. This idea resonates with mystical traditions across the world. Hermetic teachings from ancient Egypt describe the human being as a microcosm of the divine universe. Hindu scriptures speak of the Atman, the divine self within. Early Jewish mysticism explores the hidden dimensions of the soul and the living presence of divine light. Jesus stood at the crossroads of these traditions, synthesizing universal wisdom into a message simple enough for anyone to understand, yet deep enough for seekers to contemplate for centuries. Now, imagine the impact of such a message. Imagine how liberating it must have felt for those who heard him speak and understood that the divine was not reserved for priests, scribes, or elites. Jesus gave people permission to experience the sacred directly. He broke the boundaries of religious exclusivity. He showed that the path to heaven was not controlled by institutions, but opened from within the heart. But think also about how threatening this message must have seemed to the authorities of his time. A teaching that empowers individuals is a teaching that challenges structures of control. Scholars such as Reza Aslan and Bart Ehrman highlight that Jesus' spiritual message carried political implications. When he spoke of a kingdom not of this world, he was describing an inner reality that could not be manipulated by power, wealth, or force. It offered freedom that no empire could contain. Consider how these teachings echo through history in the writings of mystics like Meister Eckhart, Hildegard of Bingen, and St. John of the Cross. They describe encounters with divine presence that arise not from external ritual, but from inner awakening. Eckhart's teachings on the birth of the divine within the soul reflect the same principle Jesus expressed when he said that those who seek will find, and that the truth will set them free. Ask yourself, what happens when a person truly understands that the divine is not outside of them, but within them? What fear loses its power? What illusions dissolve? What possibilities emerge? Imagine a person who realizes this truth. They become unafraid. They become aware. They act with compassion, not because they are commanded to, but because they understand that every being is connected through the same divine essence. This is the transformation Jesus invited humanity to experience. This is the forgotten teaching that resonates across ancient manuscripts and spiritual traditions. And now, as we approach the final phase of this journey, prepare yourself. The deepest revelation is still ahead, the one most people never hear, the one that changes not only how you see Jesus, but how you see yourself. Think carefully about the journey we have taken so far. We have explored the mystical landscape surrounding Jesus, the layers of symbolic meaning woven into his teachings, and the ancient texts that reveal a far deeper spiritual message than most people ever encounter. But now we arrive at the most important revelation of all, the one that ties every fragment together, the one that scholars, mystics, and seekers across centuries have pointed to, yet few truly understand. Imagine standing before Jesus as he spoke to his disciples, not with the distant, authoritative tone often portrayed, but with the calm voice of a master guiding those ready to awaken. Imagine him looking into the eyes of each person, seeing not their flaws, not their doubts, but the divine spark waiting to be recognized. This perspective changes everything. Instead of presenting himself as a distant figure to be worshipped, he reveals himself as a mirror, a reflection of what humanity could become when fully aligned with divine consciousness. This is the essence of the forgotten teachings. Jesus did not come merely to show the path. He came to show what a fully awakened human being looks like. Pence in how revolutionary this idea truly is. Many historians, including Elaine Pagels and Karen King, point out that early Christian communities understood Jesus not just as a savior, but as an example, a demonstration of humanity's latent spiritual potential. These early groups believed that the true message of Jesus was empowerment, transformation, and the awakening of divine awareness within each individual. Over time, as institutional structures grew, this interpretation was overshadowed by doctrines that emphasized distance rather than unity, obedience rather than awakening. But the ancient texts still whisper the truth. The sayings found in the Gospel of Thomas, examined by scholars like Marvin Meyer, describe Jesus telling his followers that the light is within them, that the kingdom is already present, that when they truly come to know themselves, they will understand their divine origin. The Gospel of Philip adds that ignorance is the root of spiritual blindness, and knowledge, not ordinary knowledge but deep inner knowing, is what liberates the soul. Imagine what it means if Jesus intended each person to awaken to their own divine identity. Imagine what changes within you when you realize that his purpose was not only to teach, but to illuminate the path to your own transformation. Now think about the implications of this. If Jesus taught that the kingdom of heaven is within you, then the ultimate revelation is that divinity is not a distant force. It is the essence of your own consciousness. This is why mystics throughout history, Meister Eckhart, Jacob Boehme, and even earlier thinkers like Philo of Alexandria, describe spiritual awakening as the realization that the divine and the human are not separate. Eckhart famously wrote that the same light that shines in God shines within the soul. This idea is not foreign to the teachings of Jesus. It is central to them. Ask yourself, what would your life look like if you lived with the certainty that divine presence exists within you? How would you face challenges? How would you treat others? How would you see your own potential? This is the transformation Jesus pointed toward. He spoke of forgiveness not as a moral obligation, but as a liberation of the soul. He spoke of love not as sentiment, but as the natural expression of a being who understands unity. He taught that fear has no power when one stands in the awareness of divine truth. He showed that healing arises from alignment between thought, intention, and spiritual awareness. These are not simple moral lessons. These are principles of spiritual reality. Consider for a moment the metaphor of light. Jesus often said, "You are the light of the world." Scholars argue that this was not encouragement. It was a direct statement of spiritual identity. Light in ancient traditions symbolizes awareness, divine presence, and the power to illuminate darkness. If Jesus calls humanity light, then he is pointing to the deepest truth of human nature. Imagine the freedom that arises when you accept this. You are no longer confined by old narratives of limitation. You are no longer defined by fear, doubt, or external validation. You begin to understand that spiritual power does not come from outside forces, but from the awakening of your own inner truth. This is the profound revelation that the forgotten teachings reveal. Jesus did not ask humanity to worship him. He asked humanity to awaken with him. Think about how often he spoke of doing the works he did, and even greater works. Think about his insistence that faith could move mountains. Think about his constant emphasis on the inner world. These statements make sense only when seen through the lens of empowerment. He was not pointing to his own uniqueness, but to the universal potential within every human soul. Now, the final question emerges, the one that binds everything together. What if the true message of Jesus is that the divine has been within you from the beginning, waiting for you to recognize it? This is the message that mystics across centuries have understood. This is the truth that ancient manuscripts reveal. This is the revelation that transforms lives, breaks limitations, and awakens consciousness. Imagine embracing this truth completely. Imagine living each day with the awareness that you carry within you the same divine essence that inspired prophets, sages, and enlightened beings throughout history. Imagine what becomes possible when you no longer seek the divine outside, but recognize it as the core of your own being. This is the forgotten teaching. This is the ancient wisdom. And this is the truth Jesus sought to reveal, not to the privileged, not to the powerful, but to those willing to seek, to question, and to awaken. Let this be the beginning of your journey inward, where the kingdom of heaven awaits, not as a promise, but as a reality living within your very soul. Thanks for looking.